Hi, this is Yonit. This episode was recorded yesterday before the tragic events in Mount Meron in Israel last night. We still don't know the full magnitude of the incident during the celebrations of Lag BaOmer, and our thoughts and prayers are with the families of the dead and the wounded. We are hoping for better days and better news. Hi, I'm Yonit Levy of Channel 12 in Tel Aviv.
And I'm Jonathan Friedland of The Guardian in London.
And we are Unholy from Keshet Podcast, two Jews on the news. Hi, Jonathan.
Hello, Yonit. How are you doing?
I'm okay. You know, given everything that has been going on in Israel this week, I had a tempting career change to offer you. If you're... you have to be a little open-minded, but you maybe want to be first in the prime minister rotation. You know, Netanyahu has been handing these offers out to a few people. Maybe we could set you up.
Well, he's offering it to everyone else, so I was beginning to feel a bit kind of, what am I, chopped liver about this? Why was the call not coming to be in rotation? The problem is, if it was, let's say, you and me, I would be very relaxed about that. You know, who rotating, we can take turns leading.
No, of course, I'd be first because of,
You'd be first, I'd be second, I'd be relaxed. Sure. But with Netanyahu, you feel unless, the table that you sign the deal on is itself nailed down to the floor, you wouldn't believe a word he would say. But obviously the first demand must be, if I'm going to do this, that I must go first, because then I can control all the levers and appoint all the people to prevent what would normally happen, which is Bibi finding some way to undo the agreement we'd made. So would that be good enough? Would I be, as long as I nailed everything down, would I be wise to go into this deal?
I think it's such a great, of course, the answer is yes. And I think it's just such a great story. I mean, just think about it, right? I mean, it's Guardian columnist turned Israeli prime minister. That is a reverse ferret, if I remember correctly.
Very nice deployment of our reverse ferret. We haven't seen that for a while. It's not strictly speaking a reverse ferret, but I think, well, actually it could be, because it would be me reversing my previous position. Yeah, okay.
Exactly.
I accept it.
Exactly. And just think of how this would be the greatest excuse for you. I did not, my column didn't get in on time because I'm the Israeli prime minister. I didn't wash the dishes because I am the Israeli prime minister. I think it fits wonderfully.
I love the way your joke is predicated on the assumption that it is ridiculous for a columnist, a weekly newspaper columnist on a British newspaper, to become a prime minister. Well, I've got news for you. Yeah. Our prime minister in this country.
2 words, Boris Johnson. Right, exactly.
2 words. I mean, that is what he is. And it's one of the reasons why people like me have such a dim view of Boris Johnson is we know all his tricks. We know how this guy operates because he does the job we do. And we used to be direct colleagues with him. We know exactly all the ruses he deploys. So yes, just as I do not think it's a great idea for Britain to have a columnist turn prime minister, I may politely decline your rotation offer, Yonit, because I don't think it would be good for the people of Israel to have me as their prime minister in whatever sequence you like. But it's interesting you mention it because it's as you say, he's been asking everyone else. So, I mean, bring me up to date, because I've been away from the news for 10 seconds. So therefore, he may have offered it to someone else while I wasn't looking.
Yeah, well, I was going to ask you what box do you want to start with? Do you want to start with the what's going on with Netanyahu box, or what's going on the other side of the road with the possible Lapid-Bennett government? But I guess you want to start with the Netanyahu.
Yeah, let's start with Bibi, just because in this particular soap opera, he has been the central star, protagonist, villain, hero, whichever way you want to cut it, for so long. We have to begin with him. So what's happening with him?
So 5 days until the clock runs out. He's essentially, a pilot flying around in circles with the fuel running out, and ground controllers are trying to help him land, but are actually taking bets on when he'll crash. What the most important thing that I think happened this week in the Netanyahu box is that he tried to appoint a loyalist to the position of Minister of Justice, refusing to appoint Benny Gantz to the job, basically a breach of the basic law enacted to allow for this two-headed coalition. We have to remind our listeners maybe that the unity government is still in place, right? Because no other coalition has taken its place. This is an important move the AG blocked Netanyahu. The Supreme Court blocked him. He had to walk this back and eventually say that Gantz is the Minister of Justice. Now, why this is important is first because it's an ominous signal for all those people contemplating a rotation with Netanyahu, right? It's basically...
Like me.
Exactly. So this is a warning signal for you.
Grounds for me to be wary.
And
okay.
Secondly, it appears that Netanyahu is in something of a free fall. Really, we always treat Netanyahu as this sort of Houdini who keeps on pulling the tricks out of his sleeve and the rabbits out of the hat. And now it's more like these half-baked ideas coming out of his hat, or the half-baked rabbits, or just the sad confetti. To quote another BB King, the thrill is gone. There's something pale about him. He seems desperate. After saying all this, Jonathan, the usual warning applies when trying to say that Netanyahu maybe is at his final sort of political days. You always have to say first of all, he wants to be saved by this idea of the special fifth elections, not elections to the Knesset, but just a special election for the prime minister. And he wants to have that happen. That is his lifesaver. And again, I would still say that this is not someone who would go gentle into the night. Do we want to talk about the other side that is?
Yes, no, let's do, because the question that's always been going through people's minds is, okay, if you can just about get your head around the idea of Bibi somehow, despite, the law of gravity that seems to keep him planted in that chair, if he somehow, then what next? And there is no clear line of sight. So tell us about the anti-Bibi camp.
Yeah, so first of all, the major news in that arena is, of course, the fact that Naftali Bennett met with Mansour Abbas. And just to think of, what that means in Israeli politics, right? The one person who was head of the Yesha Council, the head of the organization of the Israeli settlements, meeting with the head of the Ram party, the Islamist party, and essentially wooing him, right? Basically trying to convince him to support a Naftali Bennett-run government. It also means that Naftali Bennett has made that decision, right, to become prime minister, which is also very dramatic. There are two groups here, and the ideology between them, there is obviously there are big differences, right? If you have Naftali Bennett, Mr. Annexation on one side, and Nitzan Horowitz, Mr. Occupation, we got to solve this problem on the other side, then there's a lot to go through to create this government. You remember in the trial of the Chicago 7 when they asked Abby Hoffman, did you collude with the other defendants to disrupt the Democratic National Convention? He said, collude with the other defendants? We can't even agree on lunch. They can't agree on lunch. So they have to decide to put aside all of their ideological differences and go for this government. Look, let's be very honest. No one knows what's going to happen. We are in the eye of a hurricane. It can go in all of these crazy directions. We really do not know where this is heading. And maybe it's an opportunity to just say how bizarre the situation is, right? When you look at the one hand, this option of, again, quote unquote, a leftist government led by Naftali Bennett in rotation with Lapid. Or on the other hand, what was an option until a week or two ago of a so-called right-wing government with the extreme right and the support of the Arab party. We are in bizarre land. That is, where we're standing.
And it's the sheer bizarreness of it is what makes me think that there may be one little bunny still up the sleeve of Netanyahu, because he benefits from the fact that the alternative could look so implausible. And he can, you just would not put it past him to find a way that if they announce they've patched something together, he then, goes over their heads, talks to the Israeli public and says, how can you believe these people? How could you have an Islamist sitting in a party with some, with Naftali Bennett, the former settler leader, he's betrayed you, and somehow chip away that it falls apart before it ever starts, because he's still got such a sway over that kind of Bibi tribe of the nationalist Likud right in the country. And I think it's the sheer incongruence and incoherence, really, of the alternative that makes me think, I'm not sure I can really see it and how it would go here. I'm interested in this idea of rotation between Bennett and Lapid. Who decides of those two who goes first?
It's been decided, and that would be Naftali Bennett.
Even though Bennett has fewer seats than Lapid.
Yes, you're searching for logic in Israeli politics, I see. That's nice. But of course, Lapid has said, and he said it, by the way, before the elections and after, he said, I will do everything I can that Netanyahu will not be prime minister. And if that means that I will say that Bennett is first in rotation, he is first in rotation. By the way, that is the only thing that would make Bennett consider this. So that is what is going to happen. They have to set up a whole apparatus to what happens when they argue, right? Because they are going to argue, and Israeli reality doesn't wait for that kind of settlement. So what happens if they argue over a rule of law, and what happens if they argue over new laws and about settlements and any other issue that you can think of. And again, what they are saying is theoretically we will set it all aside and work for the good of the country, which is like the Sharks and the Jets, right? In West Side Story saying, forget about our fights, let's just, for the good of the neighborhood. I don't know how that works. You have to also, decide who is going to sit in what ministry, who's going to have what portfolio. Good luck. It's not going to be an easy task, and they have really... The time is running out on that, right? As we said, 5 days for Netanyahu. If he indeed fails and is not pulling in, as you say, another little bunny, then they have, a limited time to bring forth their government.
I mean, it does make me think all this, because of course the premise of all this, the engine for it, is Netanyahu's desperate desire to avoid the legal consequences of his own actions and to avoid, the process that was already deeply in train of his own trial on various charges relating to corruption. And I'm thinking how envious he must be of the British system, where right now the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, is under great pressure over a whole series of very Netanyahu-like scandals.
Oh,
actually.
yeah.
I mean, they really have a very sort of Bibi and Sarah quality to them. It's about the decor of the Downing Street flat. Mm-hmm. Did they use a whole lot of extra money? I know in the Israeli context it would be, well, actually, this applies to both. There was a first initial flurry. Was it taxpayers' money? Then, no, was it a mysterious donor? Then Johnson then says, no, I've paid for it, but maybe he's paid for it eventually, paying back after a donor foot the original bill. All of this is going on. It does, translate it into Hebrew, and it really would be.
And of course, hell hath no fury like an advisor scorned, which is also a lesson that Netanyahu could have taught Boris Johnson.
Well, right. I mean, with the people we've been talking about, whether it's Naftali Bennett or also historically Victor Lieberman, they were all former advisors, weren't they, to Bibi? And here, Boris Johnson's big problem is his former advisor, Dominic Cummings, who has been sort of spilling the beans. But the key thing in the British system is ultimately the process for investigating this goes through the civil service, and who ultimately is in charge of the civil service? One Boris Johnson. Mm-hmm. He, as Prime Minister, gets to decide either whether he should be investigated or indeed whether or not he has violated the so-called ministerial code. So Bibi must look very enviously over at London and think, well, I could really use a system like that. I would have declared myself in the clear a long time ago. He doesn't have that advantage. But I think it's always worth keeping our eye on that, because that is why so much of this machinations and politicking has unfolded, because he is desperate to hold on to that chair and the immunity he thinks it grants him. I wondered if we should talk about the world outside, or rather the way is, this is like that thing in conversation when you go, anyway, enough about me. What do you think about me? Right? Because enough about Israel. What does the world think about Israel? And the reason why I'm saying it is because this week, Human Rights Watch, and there will already be unholy listeners coming out in a rash at just the mention of that organization. But Human Rights Watch put out a report, 213 pages of it, in which I think the title of the report is A Threshold Crossed. They said that Israel has crossed that threshold, in that people in Israel, and, in my hearing, not one but two Israeli prime ministers have said, former Israeli prime ministers have warned that Israel, if it continues on its path, I'm thinking of Ehud Barak and Ehud Olmert, both said if Israel continues on its path, it eventually will be practicing apartheid. And Human Rights Watch say, yep, that moment has come, that threshold has been crossed. And I've been thinking about this a lot this week, partly because, Human Rights Watch is not the first. There have been Israeli groups who've made the same move relatively recently. B'Tselem, the human rights group, said that. And Yesh Din, the legal group, have also said it meets this very particular legal standard. And what it boils down to is essentially the idea of there being two legal systems in one territory, in which one system privileges one group over another. And they say that in the West Bank, the occupied West Bank, there's a civil, if you're Jewish and Israeli, you're under civil Israeli law. And if you're Palestinian, you're under what they call draconian military rule. And the existence of those two systems, for a while, you could say, look, that's temporary. But now, and this is why Human Rights Watch say a threshold has been crossed, it's now so clearly permanent. It's 55 years. Or after June, it will be in its 55th year. And, therefore, you've got to kind of call it as it is. And you take that together with, and I'm quoting here the report, sweeping restrictions on Palestinians' movement, the near categorical denial of building permits for Palestinians, land confiscations, home demolitions, the full panoply. It is clearly designed, say Human Rights Watch, to enforce the domination of one group over another. I want to say something about how I think diaspora Jews and friends of Israel react, and actually Israelis themselves, react to this, how they have strategies for coping with bad news like this. But I know you've been reading it, Yonit, so I want to hear what you think about it.
When you read this report, what I felt really is that one thing is lacking, and when I use the word lacking as an understatement, context. There's absolutely no context. Israel didn't wake up one day and say, let's be cruel to the Palestinians, right? It isn't arbitrary. It isn't random. There is context. And the Palestinians aren't passive. Their decisions are part of the story, right? The report obviously doesn't mention Israel's attempt at making peace over 20 years, dismantling settlements in Gaza. It doesn't mention terror attacks or hundreds dead or rockets on cities all over the country. Now, I'm mentioning this because if you don't give context, then everything can be apartheid. Just to, you read from the report, but just to give an example. When you discuss the fact that Israel put basically a travel ban on Gaza, although it agreed in the Oslo Accords that Gaza and the West Bank are the same unit. And it did it in 2007. But this report doesn't say what happened in 2007. Now, something very dramatic happened in 2007, which is Hamas, a terror organization, violently took over Gaza after winning the election. I'm saying this not because it dismisses the pain of the Palestinians or that Israel is free from criticism. But if you don't mention the fact that Hamas is a terror organization that is set to annihilate Israel and took over the Gaza Strip in 2007, then you're not giving context to whoever is reading this. And I think it's important because without context, again, everything can be considered apartheid. Now, obviously that word has created huge arguments in the world. I would point to two pieces by Alon Pincus in Haaretz and Hirsch Goodman in Forward, Hirsch Goodman being actually someone who fled apartheid in South Africa, explaining why he thinks this is disingenuous. I think many Israelis feel, I'm adding into this my good friend Jeff Abramovitz, who also fled apartheid in South Africa, a lot of people feel that putting that title on this devalues the horror of what Black South Africans went through, but also adding giving the title the most odious system, one of the most odious systems we know of, to this situation is to delegitimize Israel and not to try and solve the problem. And this is where I'm kind of tying into what you're saying, Jonathan, I think, which is the point, and I think where we disagree, that issue of being temporary. And what you're saying and I don't know if it's what you're saying, what they're essentially saying is you can't, after 54 years, say that this is temporary, right? This is where I disagree. Because we are talking, right now we spent a while talking about the fact that Mansour Abbas is the most important person in Israeli politics, and Naftali Bennett met with him to woo him. If I had described the situation to you 6 months ago, you would have said I'm hallucinating. Things change, and when they do, they change fast. And something can be inconceivable, and then after it happens, it's inevitable. So I'm just saying that the fact that things, and again, it's not that they haven't changed for 54 years. They have, right? Israel has decided this, certain things, tried to make peace. Palestinians, for their own reasons, decided not to. Terror ensued in Israel. This is the narrative of the Israelis, of course, not the narrative of the Palestinians. But the point I'm trying to make in this regard is that the fact that it hasn't changed thus far is A, not an indication of the fact that people have an attempt to change it, and B, that it won't change. Did I go on a very long rant? Because I have more.
No, we could both go on, I'm sure, about it. We could do a rotation agreement for how we talk about this. Now, I think the thing about it being temporary, I felt as if that bit of the report was sort of aimed, in a way at somebody like me, because for a long time I have made a big distinction in my mind between what happens in what rather quaintly I still might call Israel proper, Israel within the Green Line, 1967 borders, and what happens in the occupied West Bank. And in a way, when you look at the actual degree of integration, not just the number of settlers in the hundreds of thousands, but just the road network, the infrastructure, etc., you begin to think maybe it's a bit naive to keep pretending these two things are not an integrated whole. And therefore, I think it is legitimate to talk about them, to talk rather about the territory Israel governs, has governed for decades, and I think we could agree is not anytime soon about to stop being the ultimate ruler of. There's that breakthrough isn't coming anytime soon. All that said, I think Human Rights Watch, by going on the apartheid thing, I think, you're right. They're doing that because that means it's the most odious system, more or less, that people can remember.
Let's say second, at least.
I was going to say, well, it's actually second most, but it's got a huge power. Funnily enough, I wonder if it was counterproductive for them, because I think it'd be more effective if they didn't put that, because the discussion is going to be entirely like the one you and I are having, entirely about the A word, rather than about the actual things. I would like there to be a discussion about the denial of building permits, about the restriction on movement, about land confiscation, about home demolition. But instead, they've made it all about apartheid. Look, I think what you've done you were wrong to call it a rant, it was much better than that, was a much better response than any I've heard from the people who are the kind of regular defenders of Israel, who immediately did the usual things. And that is the idea of finding strategies to put your fingers in your ears and not hear what is being told to you. And, that included immediate attacks on Human Rights Watch as an organization, attacking Kenneth Roth, the executive director, over things he said, inept things, stupid things, insensitive things he said on anti-Semitism in the past, or saying, look, Israel's doing really well on vaccination, so let's look over there instead.
Or saying that I think the founder of the organization admitted that they are obsessive about Israel, which is another claim that
that's true. I mean, I think Robert Bernstein did break from Human Rights Watch. They mended the rift just before his death over this issue. And yes, Human Rights Watch have got form. What I love, the standard Hasbara line is always to say, they're singling out Israel for criticism. They don't brand to anyone else. I looked into it. Human Rights Watch just last October used the apartheid label, the legal definition about Myanmar and its treatment of the Rohingya people. And they did do a report in 2018 about Hamas and Palestinian Authority and said they were crimes against humanity, specifically in terms of torture. So there are some very easy default mechanisms that I think people, particularly outside Israel actually, resort to in order to not have to deal with, forget the apartheid label, but the underlying reality that Human Rights Watch is describing, which are really uncomfortable to deal with. And I think we've got, and I say we mean people bound up with Israel, have got very good at not dealing with this stuff and not even looking at it, because we can put our fingers in our ears and go la, la, la instead.
I want to talk about the fingers in the ears, but I do want to sort of push back on something you said. First of all, I think we can agree, and again, we're fixating on that whole A word because that is what has been coming out of this. But
and they would have known that was going to happen.
Of course, and this is intentional, but because it gets headlines. But at the end of the day, this isn't racial subjugation. It isn't structural design. Israelis are stuck in this because they are afraid. Because you and I know, and every poll in Israel shows, that Israel would give up a lot and would go for this plan if they were promised or assured that they would not blow up while sitting with their families in a cafe. That is the most normal thing. They are frightened, and they went through years and years of daily terror. We all did, and that affects your thinking. And that kind of ties into what you were talking about when you said putting your fingers in your ears, because Israelis they're frustrated, they're tired, they're traumatized, and they have a limited attention span to listen to these arguments. And when you add upon that an Israeli prime minister who has decided to go for the status quo, and when you add to that the pathology of the Israeli political system, right? That the only thing that matters is to get rid of Netanyahu. So you can have an anomaly like the Israeli left, Merav Michaeli and Nitzan Horowitz, sitting with Naftali Bennett as a prime minister just to get rid of Netanyahu, then you understand the Israeli psyche and why it's hard for them to listen to the things that you are saying. And I can understand that.
That's
Was
why
I making sense?
it makes a lot of sense. And that's why I was quite careful to talk about people outside Israel.
I know, but I dragged you to talk about Israel.
No, because in a way I get that people in Israel themselves, how fear lives on. That's why I was very careful to talk about people outside the country. In a way, I'm much less forgiving of them. They don't live with the daily realities and fear you're describing. All in a way I'm asking is for people outside who, would instinctively just define themselves as supporters of Israel, forget the label, the apartheid label, look at some of the day-to-day on-the-ground reality being described in this report and reports by others, B'Tselem or Yesh Din, in which they are describing a life of closures, of restricted movement, of land confiscation, and just think it is true that there is a different reality if you are a Palestinian in the occupied West Bank than if you are a Jewish Israeli. And that difference is in a way a starting point. And, just look at it rather than trying to find a myriad set of excuses to look the other way.
Which I wanted to say that Palestinians are obviously not passive, and obviously there were deals on the table that were rejected. Maybe they weren't good enough for the Palestinians, but they're better than what you're describing now. Our editor is pulling out hairs because he wants us to move on, Jonathan. So we want to move on to a story that's been making headlines, not only in France and not only in the Jewish community. It's the story of the horrific killing of Sarah Halimi, a Parisian Jew who was murdered in 2017 by her neighbor, an immigrant from Mali called Kobili Traoré, who beat her and threw her to her death from her balcony. Now, the court decided that he cannot be held responsible for his actions, as he was in the state of a psychotic attack from drugs he used, although he chose his Jewish neighbor and the only Jew in the building, and yelled anti-Semitic curses at her. Now, all this, what it did was enrage the community, and of course they went out in rallies of thousands. It's not only that, it speaks to the helplessness of the Jewish community that kind of feels like they can't trust the system. I have a very good friend who lived in France for over a decade, and I spoke to her about the feeling that the French Republic was always that thing that had your back, and now it's the ground is shaking beneath their feet.
Yeah, a curiosity about European Jewish communities, and I include Britain in this, is that we look so often to Israel, we talk about and think about Israel or American Jewry, and we know much less about each other. So, the news about Jews in France or in Germany will reach, Jews in Britain more slowly than others. And that is how it's been even with French Jews. And yet there is an awareness that actually it is really, there are moments where it is really difficult there from, left and right, as it were, because there is, the prospect of Le Pen and that party, facing off against Macron in a presidential election on the one hand. Mm-hmm. And then on the other side, there is this really, violent history of attacks on French Jews that have, it did in this case, have come from, Muslim perpetrators. And it's very, very hard often to talk about, but there is this threat from both directions. The thing that leapt out at me in one of the accounts was this quote from the head of France's Green Party, who said that after the court's decision that he understands the agitation of the Jewish community on the issue. And it really leapt out at me partly because, there's an amazing sort of jurisprudence issue here, which is what? So if you're just on drugs, you can kill whoever you like and you're not going to face prosecution for it, or not going to have your case followed through to its conclusion. And also, as you said, it's obviously got such a very direct character. He didn't just randomly attack anyone. He attacked her. And to regard that only as something that Jews should worry about. And it reminded me a little bit of this case, which, is quite well known. It's after an attack on a synagogue in 1980 in France, in Paris. The then Prime Minister of France, Raymond Barre, said afterwards this was a despicable attack that sought to target Jews and that struck innocent Frenchmen who were crossing the Rue Copernic at the time. And this phrase, innocent Frenchman, is just extraordinary because it said that 40 years ago, the Prime Minister of France did not consider Jews either innocent or French. And obviously the leader of the French Green Party isn't saying that. But it shows you on some level that they just don't get it, that he can say he understands the agitation of the Jewish community, rather than saying he, as a French politician, is outraged that a racist hate crime like this could go unprosecuted in this way and no charges brought. And so, it seemed to me to have an echo.
You know, obviously the French Jewish community, which is the third largest in the world, but they are less than 1% of the population. Obviously, a little bit like the American Jewish community, right? They have prominent roles in politics and culture and literature, medicine, science, what have you. Now, I just asked the Jewish Agency to give me the data on how many French Jews wanted to make Aliyah, and there is really an increase of 50% in the people who asked to make Aliyah in the beginning of 2021. Now, this has to do with coronavirus as well, but just it goes to show, and again, of course, obviously Israel is supposed to be that safe haven of Jews around the world. It's its raison d'etre, if you will, but that's not solving the problem. Solving the problem is to make Jews in France feel safe. And if the legal system can't do that, or the political system, then I think we have a problem.
Yeah, that's also one that has to be handled carefully. I remember that after the attack on the Jewish kosher supermarket in 2015, that Netanyahu went to the funeral and said to French Jews, right, come to Israel rather, make Aliyah, that Israel is your real home. And, right at that moment, that wasn't that helpful because, Jews wrestle with the accusation of dual allegiances and divided loyalties. And at that moment, it's not great for an Israeli prime minister to be saying, this is where you don't belong in France, you belong in Israel. And yet, even if, of course, French Jews, like Jews everywhere, will feel a strong bond and attachment with Israel, right then their struggle was to be accepted as equal citizens of France, worthy of the protection of the state and of the law. And in this terrible case, it suggests that even after all this time, 41 years on from the attack on the synagogue, that isn't, you cannot take that as read, that you are regarded as equal and that you're, that if one of you is killed, the full force of the law will descend upon your killer. And that's what this judgment strikes, that really very, very difficult chord that goes right back to the, in the French Revolution, that famous line about to the Jews as individuals, we will give everything, to the Jews as a people, nothing. Even as individuals, there is a question mark over whether they have the full protection of their state.
Yep.
Now, despite the heaviness of the stuff you and I have managed to talk about, Yonit, we do have traditions to honour on the podcast.
You don't mess with traditions, Jonathan, especially if you're Jewish.
We are creatures of tradition, you know that. So we always like to give out a Chutzpah and Mensch award at this point in the podcast. And our chutzpah recipient, I'm not even going to say a nominee because I just think it's, well, actually there are two who I really like, but the first one must be for sheer unadulterated chutzpah. It has emerged that a man in Jerusalem who worked for years as a rabbi in an ultra-Orthodox community has been unmasked, or at least accused in a way, of faking his religion to mask his true identity, which is that he is a Christian missionary from New Jersey. I mean, this is obviously a very sensitive point. People do not like the idea of people evangelizing and trying to convert Jews to Christianity. Christian missionaries do have to historically always attach a great premium to managing to convert a Jew. But an organization, Beinenu, which monitors this, said that they found this man was dressing up in ultra-Orthodox clothes and even performed marriage ceremonies for Jewish couples in order to hide the bitter truth that he was secretly, on the sly, using his position as looking like basically a Haredi rabbi to convert people to Jesus. Apparently, it said that he assimilated into the ultra-Orthodox community, but it was a life full of lies. I just think this is almost the definition of chutzpah, that even your Haredi bearded rabbi is secretly telling you the good news of of Jesus of Nazareth. I think as conversion tactics go, I'm not sure how effective it was. There may be a lot of people who were swayed by
Shame
this
on
guy.
you, Christian rabbi.
But he apparently has said, it's a lie. I was born Jewish. He added that while he worked as a missionary 7 or 8 years ago, he had since repented. Anyway, it's a story replete with chutzpah.
It's 2021, so a priest and a rabbi walk into the bar and there's the same person, right? That has to be the case.
That's right. That would be the good setup for the joke. So that's my opening chutzpah nominee. I tell you what, I'm going to hog, to use that Jewish verb, both chutzpah nominations, and then I think because you're going to do.
Oh, so you're doing two chutzpah and I'm doing two mensch? That's what
you
we're
do
doing?
two mensch, because I've got another candidate, which is that James Carville, who was a brilliant advisor to Bill Clinton, helped get Bill Clinton elected in 1992. He gave a very wide-ranging interview with Vox and was talking about how much the Democratic Party Democratic Party have to change. They've got to be less elitist. They've got to communicate with people at kind of street level. And he said, I always tell people we've got to stop speaking Hebrew and start speaking Yiddish.
He was listening to our program, John.
I think he's probably an unholy listener. We should get Carville on this show, don't you think? We should do that.
I'll do it. When you always say when you say we you mean me. I'll do it. Okay.
You put in that call. He probably speaks Hebrew and a little bit of Yiddish
for sure.
After our Yiddish introduction on the podcast. So I just think that's great. I love the idea that in order to make the point that you shouldn't be elitist, he is making a distinction between the two Jewish languages as if his hypothetical voter in Nebraska would really understand immediately the distinction between Hebrew, the ancient language of the Bible and of prayer, with Yiddish, the kind of street lingo of the Jews in diaspora. But that's what he meant anyway. I think that's, it's cheeky of James Carville, and so he's my second chutzpah nominee.
Agreed. I think we both love James Carville. I am reminded of the fact that he was Ehud Barak's advisor in the 1999 elections. He came here against Benjamin Netanyahu, one of those times that Netanyahu lost. And he had this saying about Israel, which I kind of quote, although it's a little outdated, but he used to say Israel has a 24-hour news cycle. He said, generally, there's a 24-hour news cycle. Israel has a 1-hour news cycle. So, of course, the world has moved into a 2-second news cycle, but that was very poignant about him, for him to say about Israel. Okay, mensch nominees?
Yes, please.
Of the week. It's
I
raining.
would like to hear yours.
It's raining mensch because I have two nominees. My first one is Sapir Berman, who previously identified as a man, and she came out this week as Israel's first ever transgender soccer referee. Also received a virtual hug from Israel's most famous transgender, which is, of course, Dana International. We discovered you're a fan a few episodes ago.
Big
Jonathan.
fan of Dana International.
And this, this story is great. It also illustrates just what a country of paradoxes we are, right? I mean, the Knesset is becoming more conservative with the openly homophobic parties. And on the other hand, this story, which is, of course, making headlines all over the world.
Tell me, are Israeli football matches now being taken place again in front of crowds?
Yes. So
it'll be very interesting to see how the crowds react. I mean, it's always been said here that players, let alone officials, have been wary of coming out as gay or anything else in this country because they fear the abuse from the terraces. And it'll be very interesting to see.
Yeah, that's going to happen on Sunday, the first match.
See.
And we'll see. Thus far, she has received a lot of very, very, a lot of congratulations. People really sort of hugging her. Let's see what happens. Let's hope it's going to be okay. And the second nominee is Sir David Attenborough, or Sir Mensch David Attenborough. Obviously a natural historian, go-to authority on the natural world, with his two projects out this month. And I saw them both, Jonathan. I really recommend that you see them. One is called The Year the Earth Changed. While we were at home, the animal life kind of thrived, and that's beautiful to see. And the other is Life in Color, in which he captures sort of the dazzling colors of wildlife. Two comments on that. I hope I'm not spoiling it for anyone. One is that males make a huge effort to impress, females, and peacocks are ridiculous creatures. That's it. I'm going to put it out there. Ridiculous creatures. How did they ever survive evolution? I'm just saying. They're beautiful, but it's ridiculous.
You have put it out there. And the idea that males make a tremendous effort to impress. Did you really need David Attenborough to tell you that?
I wanted his authoritative voice, Jonathan. I think authoritative voices are important.
We have his endorsement. Maybe David Attenborough is a listener to this show. If you are, David, please do review and give us 5 stars. Tell your friends. You can also see us on Instagram at 2 Jews on the News. No numbers, just letters. And do spread the word. David Attenborough, you're pretty good at that. Communicating, tell the world about Unholy.
And we would like to thank our executive producer, Lior Friedman, and Rom Atik, head of podcast, and Arad Eshel for original music. Next week, Jonathan and I will argue about Yugoslavia in the 90s. Do tune in.
Yeah, it's going to become a permanent thing. I think maybe we can rotate our subject of disagreement. It's our first rotation agreement, but that is a deal.